Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee because today we are going to be discussing the book of 1 Samuel. Well, faithful listeners, hello and good morning and welcome to the Bible Explained podcast. I have a nice hot cup of coffee here with me today because we are going to be talking about a very long portion of scripture where David encounters this guy named Nabal and all of the crazy things that goes on in this chapter. Let's go ahead and read 1 Samuel 25, 1 through 35 today and talk about David, Nabal, and this beautiful woman named Abigail. I'll be reading out of the World English Bible or the WEB version, but grab your favorite version of the Bible and also your cup of coffee to share as we read the Bible together. Samuel died, and all of Israel gathered themselves together and mourned for him and buried him at his house in Ramah. Then David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. There was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel, and the man was very great. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. This woman was intelligent and had a beautiful face. But the man was surly and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Tell him, 'Long life to you. Peace be to you. Peace be to your house. Peace be to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds have now been with us, and we didn't harm them. Nothing was missing from them all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let the young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a good day. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David." When David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal all the words in the name of David and waited. Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants who break away from their masters these days. Shall I then take my bread, my water, and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to the men who I don't know where they came from?" So David's young men turned on their way, went back, and came and told him all these words. David said to his men, "Every man put on his sword." Every man put on his sword. David also put on his sword. About 400 men followed David, and 200 stayed by the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he insulted them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not harmed, and we didn't miss anything, as long as we were with them when we were in the fields. They were a wall to us both day and night, all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what you will do, for evil is determined against our master and against all his house, for he is such a worthless fellow that one can't speak to him." Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 containers of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 seahs of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. She said to her young men, "Go on before me. Behold, I am coming after you." But she didn't tell her husband Nabal. As she rode on her donkey and came down hidden by a mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, "Surely in vain I have kept all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertained to him. He has returned me evil for good. God, do so to the enemies of David and more also, if I leave of all that belongs to him by the morning light so much as one who urinates on a wall." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got off of her donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me, my lord, on me be the blame. Please let your servant speak in your ears. Hear the words of your servant. Please don't let my lord pay attention to this worthless fellow Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, didn't see my lord's young men whom you sent. Now therefore, my lord, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, since Yahweh has withheld you from blood guiltiness and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now therefore let your enemies and those who seek evil to my lord be as Nabal. Now this present which your servant has brought to my lord, let it be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for Yahweh will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord fights Yahweh's battles. Evil will not be found in you all your days. Though men may rise up to pursue you and to seek your soul, yet the soul of my Lord will be bound in the bundle of life with Yahweh your God. He will sling out the souls of your enemies as from the hollow of a sling. It will come to pass, when Yahweh has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, that this shall be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. When Yahweh has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. David said to Abigail, Blessed is Yahweh, the God of Israel, who sent you today to meet me. Blessed is your discretion, and blessed are you, who have kept me today from blood guiltiness, and from avenging myself with my own hand. For indeed, as Yahweh, the God of Israel lives, who has withheld me from harming you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely there wouldn't have been left to Nabal by the morning light so much as one who urinates on a wall. So David received from her hand that which she had brought to him. Then he said to her, Go up in peace to your house. Behold, I have listened to your voice and have granted your request. So it's kind of interesting because even though the book of Samuel was named after Samuel, Samuel's death almost gets completely overshadowed by this story that we see happen with David, Abigail, and this guy named Nabal. But it says in verse 1 that Samuel died, and all of Israel gathered themselves together and mourned for him and buried him at his house at Ramah. So now Samuel, the great man who helped Saul, who helped David, who was the high priest of Israel and the last judge of Israel, has now died. And all of Israel, of course, mourned for him and gave him a proper burial. But that's all it's said about Samuel's death. And then it goes into this very long story of David and this guy named Nabal. It says that David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And the wilderness of Paran happened to be very close to this place called Carmel. And there was this guy in Carmel who was shearing his sheep, is what it says. And this guy was named Nabal. And he had a wife named Abigail, who in verse 3 says this woman was intelligent and had a beautiful face. And there's only a handful of women actually in scripture that are called beautiful. And Abigail happens to be one of these women. But it says that Nabal himself was surly and evil in his doing. So he was a nasty man. In fact, even his own servants later on call him despicable, I think it was. Or no, they call him worthless. So Nabal had a reputation for being absolutely awful. However, he was extremely rich. And that's probably how he got somebody so beautiful and intelligent as his wife, I imagine, was an arranged marriage. You know, if Nabal grew up in a rich household or was very rich himself, he would have had no problem finding a beautiful wife. And Abigail just happened to be the unfortunate woman that had to marry this awful man. Which, by the way, the name Nabal actually means foolish. And so it's debated whether or not that was his birth name, if his family actually named him foolish, or if other people over time gave him the name Nabal. Unknown, but it still fit who he was as a human being. Okay, he was foolish. And this is very evident based upon this story. He was of the house of Caleb, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now, typically, the sheep shearing season was considered a season of great joy and feasting. It was a time of celebration where everybody would be doing good deeds for their fellow man, basically, like Christmas. So David heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep in verse 4. So David sent 10 messengers to the house of Nabal, and he said to his messengers, "Tell Nabal, long life to you, peace be to you, peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have." This is very important that David starts off this conversation as friendly as he possibly can, because you can imagine that if there was somebody nearby who was a fugitive and had an army, almost like a rebellion that was close to your home, you would be nervous about those men being very close to your home. And I'm sure David understands this. And so he's showing Nabal that he means no harm to him whatsoever, that he is not planning on hurting him. He is not planning on taking anything from him. In fact, David even says that he protected Nabal. When all of his shepherds were out in Carmel, David was like a wall. David and his army were like a wall for these shepherds. So anyway, verse 6, tell him long life to you, peace be to you, peace be your house, peace be to all that you have. I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds have been with us and we didn't harm them. Nothing was missing from them all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men and they will tell you. Therefore, let the young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a good day. In other words, a day of feasting, a good day of sheep shearing. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and also to your son, David. So David's asking for an amount of compensation just out of the goodwill of Nabal's heart. Because honestly, if you think about it, if somebody without asking you was protecting something that you cared about, like your resources, your wealth, and the people who worked under you, would you not want to compensate those people? Would you not be very thankful to those people? And that is exactly what David was doing. Because when Nabal's shepherds were out in Carmel, like in the wildernesses, they were open to attacks from the Philistines and whatever else armies were nearby. And David was actually protecting these shepherds who were out in the wilderness by making sure the Philistines did not harm them in any way. And also David and his own men didn't take anything from these shepherds. Not only did they give them protection, but they didn't steal from them. They didn't harm them. They didn't injure them. Nothing bad happened to Nabal's sheep, meaning his wealth, because that's what wealth was a lot of times back in these days was, cattle and sheep. Nabal's wealth was not harmed, and neither were Nabal's servants. And you can imagine Nabal not asking David to do any of this, and yet David's still doing it. Nabal should have been very appreciative, as any normal human being would have been if somebody were just out of the goodness of their heart protecting you and your wealth. Obviously, you would be thankful for that. And David is recalling all of this to Nabal. He's saying, look, we did nothing to harm your shepherds or your sheep. So because today is a day of feasting, a day of celebration, a day of goodwill, please find whatever you have and give it to us as resources, whatever food or anything else you can spare. And notice that David doesn't even ask for a specific amount. He just says, whatever you can spare. So when David's young men came to Nabal, they spoke all these words in the name of David and waited. Verse 10, Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants who break away from their masters these days. And what that means is Nabal is insulting David deeply by saying that David is nothing but a servant boy who broke away from his master Saul. That's a deep insult because David did not do that, firstly, and also Saul has been persecuting David for years now. Like, who knows how long David has been wandering around the wilderness at this point. Saul has been persecuting him for years, and Nabal purposefully insulted David. And what's even more shocking about this is Nabal certainly knew who David was. It's not like an army of men can live, a few miles away from you and you not know that they're there. Like, certainly Nabal knew David was nearby. Like, there's no way he didn't. So he's insulting David and just calling him a servant boy who broke away from his master. He says in verse 11, shall I then take my bread, my water, and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who I don't know where they came from? So David's young men turned on their way and went back and came and told David all of these words. So I'm sure the young men were very insulted, and David certainly takes this as an insult. So he says to his men, put on your sword. So everybody straps on their swords, and David also puts on his sword. And David was very wrong to have this response. And it's kind of curious, actually, that David had this response, knowing how he's been treating his enemies in the past, specifically Saul. Like, he was so gracious towards Saul. I kind of wonder if David traveling around the wilderness and having some bitterness in his heart towards Saul was causing him to have this extreme reaction towards Nabal. Because David isn't setting out to just kill Nabal. In fact, David, it says, is setting out to kill every man in Nabal's household. Here's what it says, jumping down a little bit to verse 21 and 22. David had said, "Surely in vain I have kept all that this fellow had in the wilderness, so that nothing was missing of all that pertained to him. He has returned me evil for good. God, do so to the enemies of David and more also, if I leave of all that belongs to him by the morning light so much as one who urinates on a wall." That means, okay, so David is being kind of graphic here, actually. This basically means David is going to kill every single male in the household of Nabal. Because obviously, without going into too much detail, women can't urinate on a wall. Like, really only men have the functionality to do that. So David is just being graphic and saying, I'm going to kill all of the men in Nabal's household. But meanwhile, while David is like preparing for war against Nabal's household, Abigail, Nabal's wife, finds out about what happened with David. Jumping back up to verse 14. One of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he insulted them." So everybody knew this was an insult. Like, this was not hidden at all, that Nabal was purposefully trying to insult David. "But the men were very good to us, and we were not harmed. We didn't miss anything. And as long as we were with them, when we were in the fields, they were a wall to us, both day and night. All the while we were with them, keeping the sheep." So the young man talking to Abigail is like, we owe David something. He protected us. We had no problems. We had no issues this entire time that we were with David and his men. They treated us so well, and they protected us out in the fields, which could be very dangerous. So then the young man tells Abigail, "Consider what you will do, for evil is determined against our master and against all of his house, for he is such a worthless fellow that one can't speak to him." And that is why this young man went to Abigail instead of Nabal, because this young servant boy knew that Nabal was a foolish man. He was so foolish that nobody could go and talk to him. What's really interesting about this is this shows the mercy of God, because Nabal is so arrogant. He is so foolish. He is so unkind to people. And yet, God is so kind to Nabal, giving him so much material wealth, giving him so much. He gave him not only material wealth, but also a beautiful wife and a wise wife and tons of servants and protection from the Philistines because of David. And Nabal was slapping God in the face. It says in Matthew 10:42, "Whoever gives to one of these little ones, those who are humble in rank or influence, even a cup of cold water to drink because he is my disciple, truly I say to you, he will not lose his reward." So if doing something so simple as giving a cup of cold water to somebody for them to drink, and doing it in Jesus' name because you know that Jesus wants you to do that, like, water is very easy to come by. It's a very simple thing to do, is to give somebody a cup of cold water. Jesus says that you will have a reward just for that little action. And yet Nabal was refusing any food or water or resources that he could spare to give to David. He was refusing David all of that. So Nabal, in a sense, is slapping God in the face because God gave Nabal everything that Nabal had out of his mercy. And yet Nabal was holding on to those things as if they belonged to him. So now Abigail hears about what her foolish husband has done, and she acts extremely quickly. Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 containers of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 seahs of parched grain. My little footnote says a seah is about 7 liters or 1.9 gallons or 0.8 pecks. So almost 2 gallons of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. So she's loading up these donkeys with all of these resources to give to David. So she's acting very quickly. This also shows how rich Nabal was, that Abigail was quickly able to find these things in the storehouses and put them on donkeys. So Nabal was extremely, extremely wealthy for them to just have 200 loaves of bread available and ready that very day for Abigail to take. And she had to have acted extremely quickly in all of this also. So she's loading up all these gifts on donkeys, and she tells her young men, "Go before me, I am coming after you." But she didn't tell her husband, Nabal, that she was going. So she acted on her own behalf, and she was doing this, honestly, to protect herself and all of the household that she lived in, because she knew that this was bad, that her husband crossed a line. And I don't know if Abigail knew that David was the anointed or not. Perhaps she did. But nonetheless, she knew her husband certainly crossed a line. So it says she rode on her donkey and came down hidden by the mountain. So it seems like she was at the bottom of the mountain, and David was kind of like at the top, so he couldn't see her quite yet, or maybe it's the opposite, I'm not sure. But she was hidden by the mountain somehow, and so when David, it seems like, rounds the corner, Abigail's right there. It says she met him. Oh yeah, she was below him. Behold, David and his men came down to her, and she met them. And so now, moving to verse 23, Abigail gives this big speech. It says, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got off her donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground. And it's very possible that this was how David encountered Abigail. It's very possible he did not see her face at all and just saw her on the ground in front of him and his men. So she says, "On me, my Lord, on me be the blame. Please let your servant speak in your ears. Hear the words of your servant. Please don't let my Lord pay attention to this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name," which means foolishness, "and folly is with him. But I, your servant, didn't see my Lord's young men whom you sent." So she's like, "David, I am your servant." And this was a very typical way for Hebrew people to talk when they were trying to show honor to another person. They would often call themselves the servant of that person. So Abigail's like, "I am your servant, David. I am not your equal. I am not above you. I am your servant. So put the blame on me, not on Nabal. Put the blame on me because I didn't see your young men come to the house." And Nabal, he's a foolish man. His name means foolish, and that is exactly what he is. He is a foolish man. So please put the blame on me, because had I seen your young men, I would have acted differently. Now, some people wonder if this was right for Abigail to say about her husband. I have mixed feelings about that one. Personally, because it says that Scripture called her a wise woman, I do think that it was wise for her to point to her husband's name and tell David he acted foolishly. Look at his name. I mean, that just proves that he is acting foolishly. Part of me thinks that, yes, it was good for Abigail to say that, because it is important to call out sin. It is important to say that somebody has done something wrong. And Abigail, of course, did say her husband did something wrong. And there's nothing wrong with saying that your spouse isn't perfect, obviously. But I can also see the other side of the coin, where Abigail was down talking her husband to another man. And I'll get more into that in a second. So anyway, she says in verse 26, therefore, my Lord, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, since Yahweh has withheld you from blood guiltiness and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now therefore let your enemies and those who seek evil to my Lord be as Nabal. So she's speaking in such a way as to make David feel a little bit guilty about what he's about to do. Because she's like, David, I am so thankful that that I'm here and that God has stopped you from killing Nabal's household, because anybody who takes vengeance like that is like Nabal. And that's the part that gets kind of weird. Let me switch over to the NIV version and read this same part out of the NIV. So here's what it says, verse 26. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And the reason that is a little bit weird is because it almost sounds like Abigail is telling David that Nabal deserves to die. Let your enemies be like Nabal. So yeah, it does kind of sound like she is telling David that Nabal does deserve to die for what he did, because Nabal is such a fool and he's so awful that yes, he deserves to die. But it could also mean giving Abigail a little bit more benefit of the doubt. It could also mean, just based upon Nabal's name, which means foolish, all of David's enemies are foolish, similar to Nabal's name. But switching back to the WEB and moving forward, verses 27 through 29 approximately, Abigail spends some time kind of flattering David, but not exactly, because she's reminding David of the blessings that Yahweh is about to give him. Verse 29, though men may rise up to pursue you and seek your soul, the soul of my Lord will be bound in the bundle of life. With Yahweh your God, he will sling out the souls of your enemies as from the hollow of a sling. It will come to pass when Yahweh has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you and appointed you prince over Israel, that this shall be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord. So she's like, when Yahweh does all these wonderful things for you, David, when you become a leader over the people of Israel, just as God told you that you were going to be, you're not even going to remember Nabal. He's not going to even come to your mind because of all of these blessings that God is going to give you. And then she says in verse 31, and this is actually out of the NIV again. Sorry, I'm switching back and forth so much. My Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. Then she says, and when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. A lot of people translate that as Abigail being kind of forward with David. And it could be, but quite honestly, I don't really want to assume Abigail's intentions there. It does kind of seem sort of forward if you're looking at it in the context. She does not seem to be at all happy with her husband. She insults him pretty deeply multiple times in this. She calls him worthless. She calls him a fool. She says that folly is following him. She kind of implies that he deserves to die. And then at the very end, she says, when Yahweh has given you good things, remember your servant. So I don't know. Maybe she was being forward. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was just trying to get out of this situation in whatever way that she possibly could. I don't know, though. I am not going to say one way or the other. But David is very impressed by Abigail. Obviously, she's super beautiful. We know that David himself had a thing for women. He really liked his ladies, which, by the way, actually, no, I'm not going to go into that right now. I will put a pin on that and talk about it on Monday. But we know that David had a thing for the ladies. And so since Abigail is super beautiful, David is very impressed to meet Abigail. He says to Abigail, "Blessed is Yahweh, the God of Israel, who sent you today to meet me. Blessed is your discretion, and blessed are you who have kept me today from blood guiltiness and from avenging myself with my own hand. For indeed, as Yahweh, the God of Israel lives, who has withheld me from harming you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely there wouldn't have been left to Nabal by morning light so much as one who urinates on a wall." So David's like, yeah, I certainly was going to come and kill all of the men in your household. He's like, good thing you hurried and got to me, because now I am not going to avenge by my own hands. So it says that David received the gifts from her, which she brought to him. And then he said to her, "Go in peace to your house. I have listened to your voice and have granted your request." So David leaves Abigail alone. He does not go up to kill Nabal. David is put in the right frame of mind again, because he heard truth. And David absolutely knew that it was wrong to avenge oneself. It says in scripture, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." David knew that. David knew that God did not want people to avenge themselves. And yet David was still going to go avenge himself of the insult that Nabal gave to him. And I personally think that the many years of fleeing from Saul and the bitterness that David might have had in his heart at this point in time was causing him to not think so clearly. But Abigail, being an intelligent person, helped David think more clearly. Well, this was kind of a long episode today. We did talk about a lot of different things. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And on Monday, we'll finish out this chapter and talk more about David's problem with women. So that will be something to look forward to on Monday. I hope you guys all have a fantastic weekend. Happy listening, and God bless.